The envelope bearing her handwriting landed on the porch of the boarding house in Denver with a soft thud, stamped in black ink with the words that had become heartbreakingly familiar. Return to sender addressee deceased. Florence Norwood stood frozen in the dusty street, watching Mrs. Patterson hand her the letter with eyes full of pity. This was the fourth one. 4 letters sent across 2 states to the man she had promised to marry. 4 letters that came back marked with the finality of death. Robert had been dead for 3 months now, killed in a mining accident in California, and yet Florence kept finding herself reaching for pen and paper in the evenings, pouring her thoughts onto the page as if he might somehow still read them. The habit of writing to him had become so ingrained during their 2-year engagement that she could not seem to stop, even knowing that her words would never reach their intended destination. "You should stop torturing yourself, dear," Mrs. Patterson said gently, her weathered hand patting Florence's arm. "The Lord took him home, and no amount of writing will bring him back." Florence nodded mutely, clutching the unopened letter to her chest as she walked back toward her small room above the millinery shop where she worked. At 22 years old, she felt as though her life had ended before it had truly begun. Robert had been her childhood sweetheart, the boy who had pulled her braids in the schoolhouse in Missouri before the war, the young man who had kissed her for the first time beneath the cottonwood trees by the creek. When he had gone west to seek his fortune in the gold fields, she had remained behind to care for her ailing mother, writing him faithfully twice a week, planning for the day when he would send for her and they would finally begin their life together. That day had never come. Her mother had passed the previous autumn, and by the time Florence had settled her affairs and prepared to journey to California, the telegram had arrived with news of the cave and that had taken Robert's life along with 7 other miners. She had no family left now, no ties to Missouri, and no reason to go to California. Denver had seemed as good a place as any to start over, to find work and try to build some semblance of a future from the ruins of her dreams. But the letters kept coming back, each one a fresh wound, a reminder of everything she had lost. That evening, Florence sat at the small table in her room, the lamp casting long shadows across the walls as she carefully opened the returned envelope and unfolded the pages she had written 3 weeks earlier. Her own words stared back at her, filled with observations about her new life in Denver, descriptions of the mountains that rose so dramatically to the west, questions about Robert's work that would never be answered. It seemed such a waste, all these words with nowhere to go, all these thoughts and feelings locked inside her, with no outlet for expression. She was still sitting there, staring at the letter, when her landlady knocked on the door. "Miss Norwood, there is a gentleman downstairs asking for you. Says his name is Xander Morrison." Florence frowned, trying to place the name. She knew no one in Denver well enough to receive callers, certainly no men. "Did he say what he wanted?" "Only that he needed to speak with you about a personal matter. He seems respectable enough. Came in on the evening stage from the mountains. I told him I would see if you were receiving." Curiosity overcame caution, and Florence followed Mrs. Patterson downstairs to the parlor where visitors were entertained. The man who rose to greet her was tall and broad-shouldered, his face weathered by sun and wind, his dark hair slightly too long beneath his hat. He held himself with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to hard work and open spaces, and his eyes, when they met hers, were a startling shade of gray-blue that seemed to see right through her carefully maintained composure. "Miss Norwood," he said, his voice low and respectful. "Thank you for seeing me. I know this is irregular, and I apologize for calling without an introduction, but I believe I have something that belongs to you." He reached into the leather satchel he carried and withdrew a bundle of letters tied with string. Florence recognized her own handwriting on the envelopes and felt her face flush with confusion and embarrassment. "I don't understand," she said. "How did you come by my letters?" "They were found among the effects of Robert Hendricks after the accident," Xander explained. "I was his crew foreman at the mine. When we sorted through his belongings to send them to his family, we found these addressed to him but marked for return. The Postal Service had sent them back to the mine office by mistake instead of to you directly. I have been carrying them around for weeks, trying to determine how to get them to you without causing you further pain. Finally, I decided the only proper thing to do was to deliver them in person and offer my condolences for your loss." Florence sank into the nearest chair, her hands trembling as she reached for the letters. There were more than a dozen of them, all the ones she had sent after Robert's death, all marked with that terrible black stamp. Xander Morrison stood awkwardly by, clearly uncertain whether he should stay or go. "Robert was a good man," he said quietly. "One of the best workers I ever had, and always honest and fair in his dealings. He spoke of you often, showed me the miniature portrait you had sent him. He was counting the days until he could send for you." Tears burned in Florence's eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. She had cried enough over the past months. "Thank you for bringing these to me, Mr. Morrison. It was kind of you to go to such trouble." "It was no trouble, miss. I had business in Denver anyway, and I felt it was the least I could do." He hesitated, turning his hat in his hands. "If you will forgive my forwardness, Robert mentioned that you had no family left in Missouri. I hope you have found friends here to help you through this difficult time." "I am managing well enough," Florence said, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. "I have work and a roof over my head. That is more than many can say." Xander nodded, but his eyes held a skepticism that suggested he knew she was not managing as well as she claimed. "If you ever find yourself in need of assistance, I run a ranch up in the San Juan Mountains, near a little settlement called Animas Forks. It is remote and the winters are harsh, but we always need people willing to work hard. I employ a housekeeper and a cook. And there are several families in the area who could use a woman's help with sewing and such." "That is very kind of you, Mr. Morrison, but I could not possibly accept charity from a stranger." "It would not be charity, Miss Norwood. It would be honest work for honest wages. I make the offer only because Robert was a friend as well as an employee, and I know he would have wanted someone to look after you if he could not." Xander set a card on the table beside her. "If you change your mind, you can reach me through the general store in Animas Forks. They hold my mail." After he had gone, Florence sat for a long time, holding the bundle of returned letters and the calling card. She knew she should burn the letters, put the past behind her, and focus on building a future in Denver. But something in the way Xander Morrison had looked at her, with compassion but no pity, with understanding but no judgment, made her think that perhaps not all hope was lost. Perhaps there were still good people in the world, people who kept their promises and honored their obligations even when it cost them time and trouble. The next morning, Florence wrote another letter. She did not intend to send it, but the words came anyway, flowing onto the page as naturally as breathing. She wrote about meeting Xander Morrison, about the strange kindness of a stranger traveling all the way to Denver to return her unopened letters. She wrote about the offer he had made, about the possibility of starting fresh in a place where no one knew her story or her losses. She wrote until her hand cramped and the light began to fade, and then she folded the pages carefully and tucked them into her journal. The next week brought no change in her circumstances. The millinery shop was busy as summer approached, and ladies ordered new bonnets for the season. But Florence found the work increasingly tedious, the endless stream of ribbons and artificial flowers a poor substitute for the life she had imagined having by now. She should have been setting up housekeeping in her own home, planning meals and tending a garden, perhaps expecting her first child. Instead, she was living in a single room above a shop, spending her days surrounded by women who pitied her, and her evenings alone with only her thoughts for company. She wrote another letter that week, pouring out her frustrations and fears onto the page, and then another. The words came easier each time, as if by giving voice to her feelings, she could somehow make sense of them, find order in the chaos of grief and disappointment. But now, there was no address to write on the envelope, no one to send the letters to, even if she had wanted to mail them. 3 weeks after Xander Morrison's visit, Florence returned to her room after a particularly trying day to find another letter waiting for her. This one was not one of her own returned, but a fresh envelope addressed in a strong, angular hand she did not recognize. Inside was a brief note written on plain paper. "Miss Norwood, I hope this letter finds you well. I have been thinking about our conversation and about the letters you wrote that never reached their destination. It occurred to me that perhaps you might find some comfort in continuing to write, not to the past, but to the present. If you have need of a correspondent, someone to read the words you wish to say, I would be honored to serve in that capacity. Write to me if you wish. I promise I will read every single word. Respectfully, Xander Morrison." Florence read the letter 3 times, her heart beating faster with each reading. It was an extraordinary offer, one that no respectable woman should even consider accepting. She knew nothing about this man beyond what he had told her, had no references for his character beyond his claim to have been Robert's foreman, Writing to an unmarried man she barely knew would be considered scandalously forward by any standard of propriety. And yet, as she sat at her small table that evening, with the lamp burning low, she found herself pulling out a fresh sheet of paper and dipping her pen in the ink. "Dear Mr. Morrison," she wrote, "your offer surprised me, but I find I am grateful for it nonetheless. You are right that I find comfort in writing, and I have missed having someone to share my thoughts with. If you are truly willing to read these letters, then I will try not to bore you with the mundane details of my daily life. Today it rained in Denver, a cold spring rain that made the streets muddy and treacherous. A woman came into the shop seeking a bonnet to match a particular shade of blue silk, and we spent an hour sorting through ribbons before she declared that none would do and left without purchasing anything. Such is the nature of my work. I wonder what your days are like in the mountains, whether you spend them on horseback or in the ranch house, whether the snow has melted from the high passes yet. I wonder if I am being foolish to write to you at all, and if you will regret making your offer when you receive this rambling reply. Sincerely, Florence Norwood." She posted the letter the next morning before she could think better of it, and then spent the following days in a state of nervous anticipation, wondering if he would truly write back or if his offer had been merely a polite gesture he had not expected her to accept. 2 weeks later, his reply arrived. "Dear Miss Norwood, you could never bore me with the details of your life. I find I am very interested to know about your days, even the mundane parts. Here in Animas Forks, the snow is beginning to melt in the valleys, though the peaks remain white and will likely stay that way through July. My days are spent mostly on horseback, checking on the cattle and sheep, repairing fences damaged by winter storms, and preparing for the summer grazing season. It is hard work but satisfying, and I find I prefer it to the mining work I did in my younger days. There is something honest about working with animals and land, something that settles the soul in a way that digging in the dark never could. I am glad you wrote to me. Please do not hesitate to write again whenever the spirit moves you. Sincerely, Xander Morrison." And so began a correspondence that would change both their lives in ways neither could have predicted. Florence found herself writing to Xander 2 or 3 times a week, filling page after page with observations and questions, sharing stories from her childhood in Missouri and her present struggles in Denver. He replied faithfully to every letter, his responses growing longer and more personal as the weeks passed. He told her about his own past, about growing up in Texas before the war, about losing his parents to fever and making his way west to find work in the mines, about saving every dollar he could until he had enough to buy a small ranch in the high country, where the air was clean and a man could build something lasting. His letters revealed a thoughtful, educated man, despite his rough occupation, someone who read books when he could get them and thought deeply about the world beyond his mountain valley. He asked intelligent questions about her life and opinions, treating her as an equal rather than as a fragile creature to be protected and coddled. In his letters, Florence found a freedom she had never experienced before, the freedom to be fully herself without fear of judgment or constraint. By midsummer, she realized with a start that she was no longer writing to a stranger, but to a friend, and perhaps something more than a friend. She had begun to look forward to his letters with an eagerness that had nothing to do with mere correspondence, and everything to do with the flutter in her chest when she recognized his handwriting on an envelope. She caught herself thinking about him at odd moments during the day, wondering what he was doing, whether he was thinking of her, whether the feelings that had begun to grow in her heart were reciprocated in his. It was a warm evening in July when Xander's letter arrived containing an invitation that would force Florence to confront the truth of her feelings. "Dear Florence," he wrote, using her given name for the first time, "I hope you will forgive the familiarity, but after 6 months of correspondence, I feel we have moved beyond the formality of surnames. I am writing to ask if you would consider visiting Animas Forks. My housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, has family in California she wishes to visit for a month, and I find myself in need of someone to manage the household while she is away. The work would be similar to what you do now, but with better pay and mountain air instead of city dust. More importantly, I confess I have a selfish motive for inviting you. I would very much like to meet you in person, to see if the connection I feel when I read your letters translates to reality when we are face to face. If you are at all interested, I will arrange for your passage on the stage and ensure you have proper accommodations in town, separate from the ranch house, so there can be no question of impropriety. Please consider it. I remain With great affection, Xander Morrison. Florence's hands shook as she folded the letter and pressed it to her chest. She should refuse, of course. It was madness to travel into the mountains to stay with a man she had never properly met, to risk her reputation and her safety on the strength of written words alone. But the truth was that Denver had never felt like home, and the thought of spending another winter alone in her small room above the millinery shop filled her with a despair she could no longer deny. More than that, she wanted to meet Xander Morrison in person, wanted to see if his eyes truly were that unusual gray blue, or if she had imagined it, wanted to hear his voice speaking the words she had only read on paper, wanted to know if the warmth she felt reading his letters would transform into something deeper and more substantial in his presence. She gave her notice at the millinery shop the next day and began preparing for the journey into the mountains. The stage journey from Denver to Animas Forks took 2 days and was one of the most uncomfortable experiences of Florence's life. The roads were rutted and rough, climbing steadily into increasingly wild and rugged terrain. They passed through small mining camps and settlements, each more remote than the last, until finally the stage began the ascent into the high country of the San Juan Mountains. The air grew thinner and colder, and Florence found herself gasping slightly as they climbed above 10,000 feet. The landscape was breathtakingly beautiful, all jagged peaks and deep valleys covered with pine and aspen, wild rivers rushing with snowmelt, and meadows carpeted with wildflowers. Animas Forks itself was little more than a collection of rough buildings clustered in a narrow valley at over 11,000 feet elevation. The settlement existed primarily to support the mining operations in the surrounding mountains, and most of the inhabitants were miners or those who supplied the miners with necessities. It was remote, harsh, and beautiful, in a way that made Florence's heart ache with something she could not quite name. Xander was waiting at the stage stop when they arrived, and Florence recognized him immediately despite the months that had passed since their first meeting. He looked older somehow, more weathered, but his eyes held the same kindness and intelligence she remembered. When he smiled at her, she felt something shift in her chest, a rightness that she had not felt since before Robert's death. "Miss Norwood," he said, offering his hand to help her down from the stage. "Welcome to Animas Forks. I hope the journey was not too arduous." "Mr. Morrison," she replied, suddenly shy now that they were face to face. "Thank you for inviting me. The journey was long, but the scenery made up for the discomfort." He collected her trunk and led her down the main street to a small but neat boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Harper. "I have arranged for you to stay here," he explained as they walked. "Mrs. Harper is a respectable woman and will serve as your chaperone while you are in town. The ranch is about 3 miles from here, an easy ride on horseback or a slightly longer trip by wagon. I thought we might let you settle in today and begin work tomorrow, if that suits you." "That would be perfect," Florence said, though in truth she was not thinking about work at all. She was thinking about how tall Xander was, how his presence beside her made her feel both protected and excited, how the mountain air seemed to sharpen all her senses until she was hyper-aware of every small detail of this moment. Mrs. Harper proved to be a cheerful woman in her 50s who asked no prying questions, but made it clear through gentle hints that she would be keeping a close eye on the situation between Florence and Xander. She showed Florence to a clean room with a window overlooking the valley and left her to unpack and rest before supper. That evening, Xander returned to take Florence to dinner at the small restaurant that served as the social center of Animas Forks. Over plates of beef stew and fresh bread, they talked with the ease of old friends, the initial awkwardness fading as they discovered that the connection they had felt through letters was, if anything, stronger in person. Xander told her about the ranch, about the challenges of raising livestock at such high altitude, and the satisfaction of building something with his own hands. Florence found herself sharing more about her life than she had intended, about the loneliness of the past year, and the feeling that she had been merely existing rather than truly living. "I felt the same way after my parents died," Xander said quietly. "Like I was just going through the motions, waiting for something to give my life meaning again. It was not until I came to these mountains and started building the ranch that I began to feel alive again, like I had a purpose beyond simple survival." "Is that why you invited me here?" Florence asked, emboldened by the intimacy of the conversation. "To give me a purpose?" "Partly," Xander admitted, his gray-blue eyes holding hers across the table. "But mostly I invited you because I found myself thinking about you constantly, wondering if you were well, wishing I could see your face when you laughed at something I had written. I know this is all very sudden and perhaps improper, but I have never been one for games or pretense. I think you should know that my feelings for you have grown beyond simple friendship, Florence. I understand if you do not feel the same way, if you need more time after your loss, but I wanted to be honest with you from the start. Florence's heart raced, but she met his gaze steadily. I think I have known for some time that my feelings were changing too, she said softly. I tried to tell myself it was just gratitude, or loneliness, or the comfort of having someone to write to. But the truth is that I have come to care for you very much, Xander. I think perhaps that is why I agreed to come here, despite all the very sensible reasons I should have stayed in Denver. The smile that spread across Xander's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, and Florence felt an answering warmth bloom in her chest. It was too soon, perhaps, to call it love, but she recognized it as something with the potential to become love, given time and nurturing. The next morning, Xander arrived with a gentle mare for Florence to ride out to the ranch. The 3-mile journey took them through spectacular country, following a rushing creek upstream to where the valley opened into a natural basin surrounded by peaks still white with snow. The ranch house was a sturdy log structure with a wide porch and windows that looked out over the meadows where cattle grazed. There were several outbuildings, including a barn, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, and a small cabin where Mrs. Chen lived when she was in residence. Mrs. Chen greeted Florence warmly, a small Chinese woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She spent the morning showing Florence the household routine, the organization of the kitchen and pantry, the schedule for meals and cleaning. It was more work than Florence had done in years, but it was also more satisfying. There was something deeply pleasant about working in a real home rather than a shop, about cooking meals that would nourish hard-working men rather than trimming bonnets for idle ladies. Over the following weeks, Florence settled into a rhythm at the ranch. She woke early to start breakfast for Xander and his 3 ranch hands, spent her days cooking and cleaning and tending the large garden behind the house, and often lingered after supper to talk with Xander on the porch as the long summer twilight faded into darkness. Mrs. Chen had departed for California, and Mrs. Harper made the journey out to the ranch twice a week to maintain propriety. But Florence found that reputation mattered less to her with each passing day. What mattered was the way Xander looked at her across the dinner table, with warmth and affection that made her feel beautiful and valued. What mattered was the sound of his laugh when she told him stories from her childhood, and the way he listened to her opinions about everything from politics to poetry, as if what she thought actually mattered. What mattered was the growing certainty in her heart that this man, this place, this life, was what she had been searching for without knowing it. One evening in late August, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Xander took her hand in his. His palm was rough with calluses, his fingers strong and warm, and Florence felt her breath catch at the simple contact. "Florence," he said, his voice low and serious, "I know it has not been long, and I know you are still grieving for Robert, but I need to tell you that I have fallen in love with you. Completely, irrevocably in love. I love the way you see beauty in small things, the way you make this house feel like a home, the way you challenge me to think differently about the world. I love your strength and your kindness and your willingness to take risks for the sake of finding something better. I know I should wait longer, give you more time, but life is short and uncertain, especially out here, and I do not want to waste a moment of whatever time we are given." Florence turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I love you too," she whispered. "I did not think I would ever feel this way again, and I felt guilty at first, as if loving you meant forgetting Robert. But I have realized that the heart is more capacious than I knew, that we can honor the past while still embracing the future. Robert would have wanted me to be happy, and you make me happier than I ever imagined being again." Xander cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, gentle at first and then with growing passion, and Florence kissed him back with all the love and longing that had been building in her for months. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers and smiled. "Marry me," he said. "Stay here with me. Build a life with me in these mountains. I know it is hard country and the winters are brutal, but I promise I will spend every day trying to make you happy." "Yes," Florence said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." They were wed 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony in the parlor of the boarding house, with Mrs. Harper and the local minister as witnesses. Florence wore a dress of cream silk that she had sewn herself, and Xander wore his best suit, looking handsome and slightly uncomfortable in the formal clothing. As they exchanged vows, promising to love and cherish each other through all the challenges and joys that lay ahead, Florence felt a peace settle over her that she had not felt in years. This was where she was meant to be, not in Missouri mourning a lost past, not in Denver marking time, but here in the high mountains with a man who saw her for who she truly was and loved her for it. The wedding celebration was attended by most of the residents of Animas Forks, a rough but good-hearted community that had embraced Florence during her time there. There was music and dancing, abundant food and drink, and a genuine warmth that made Florence feel welcomed and accepted. As the evening wore on and she danced with her new husband under the stars, she thought about the letters that had brought them together, the words that had traveled between them and created a bridge from her loneliness to his understanding. She thought about all the letters to Robert that had come back unopened, and while she would always carry a small sadness for the life they had not been able to share, she was grateful now for how things had unfolded. If Robert had lived, she would never have come to Denver, would never have met Xander, would never have discovered this capacity for love that she had not known she possessed. That night, as Xander carried her across the threshold of their home, Florence felt truly married for the first time in her life. She had been prepared to be Robert's wife, but she had been so young then, so naive about what marriage really meant. Now, at 23, she understood that love was not just romance and grand gestures, but also the quiet intimacy of daily life shared with someone who knew you completely and chose you anyway. Xander set her down gently in the bedroom they would now share, and as he helped her out of her wedding dress, his hands tender and careful, Florence felt a rush of desire mixed with nervousness. She knew the basic facts of what was to come, but knowing and experiencing were very different things. "We can take our time," Xander murmured against her hair, sensing her uncertainty. "There is no rush. We have all the time in the world." But Florence shook her head, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "I am not afraid," she said, and realized it was true. "I trust you completely." Their wedding night was everything she could have hoped for, tender and passionate by turns, awkward in moments, but also filled with laughter and genuine connection. Xander was patient and attentive, and Florence discovered that her body was capable of pleasures she had never imagined. When they finally fell asleep in each other's arms as dawn was breaking over the mountains, she felt transformed, no longer a girl, but a woman who had chosen her own fate and found happiness on her own terms. The first year of their marriage was not without challenges. Florence had to learn the rhythms of ranch life, had to adapt to the isolation and the harsh realities of living at such high altitude. The first winter was particularly difficult, with snowdrifts that buried the house to the roofline and temperatures that dropped far below zero. There were days when they were completely snowed in, unable to even reach the barn to tend the animals, and Florence learned what true cold felt like, when even the fire in the hearth could not entirely dispel the chill. But there were also moments of stunning beauty and deep contentment. She learned to ski on wooden skis that Xander fashioned for her, and they would glide through the silent white landscape together, alone in a world of snow and ice and brilliant blue sky. She learned to bake bread that rose properly at high altitude, to preserve vegetables and meat for the long winter, to card and spin wool from their sheep into yarn for knitting warm clothes. She read aloud to Xander in the evenings from the books they ordered from Denver, and they discussed ideas and argued good-naturedly about philosophy and politics. Mrs. Chen returned from California in October and became a dear friend to Florence, teaching her Chinese cooking and sharing stories of her own remarkable life, how she had come to America as a young woman seeking opportunity and had ended up in the mining camps of Colorado through a combination of chance and determination. The three ranch hands, Pedro, Jacob, and William, treated Florence with respect and affection, and she learned to manage the household with confidence. By their first anniversary, Florence knew she was pregnant. She had suspected for several weeks, but had waited to be certain before telling Xander. When she finally shared the news with him over breakfast one morning in September, his face lit up with such pure joy that she felt her own happiness reflected and amplified. "A baby," he said wonderingly, pulling her into his arms. "We are going to have a baby. When?" "I think sometime in March or early April. Florence said, laughing as he spun her around the kitchen. "We will have a spring baby." The pregnancy was easier than Florence had feared, though the altitude made her more breathless than usual, and she tired quickly. Xander was attentive to the point of being overprotective, trying to prevent her from doing any heavy work and worrying constantly about her health. Mrs. Chen, more practical, assured them both that women had been having babies at high altitude for centuries, and Florence was strong and healthy. As winter closed in again, Florence spent her time preparing for the baby's arrival, sewing tiny clothes and knitting blankets, transforming one of the spare rooms into a nursery. Xander built a beautiful cradle from pine wood, carving decorative patterns into the headboard with painstaking care. They discussed names endlessly, finally settling on Samuel for a boy and Clara for a girl, both names from Florence's family. The baby came in early April, during a spring snowstorm that made it impossible to fetch the midwife from town. Mrs. Chen, who had delivered many babies in her time, took charge with calm efficiency, and Xander held Florence's hand through the long hours of labor, murmuring encouragement and love, even as she gripped his fingers hard enough to hurt. Samuel Morrison entered the world just as dawn was breaking, a lusty, healthy boy with dark hair and his father's gray-blue eyes. Florence held him against her chest and wept with joy and relief, all the pain of the past hours forgotten in the overwhelming love she felt for this tiny, perfect person she and Xander had created together. "He is beautiful," Xander whispered, his own eyes wet with tears as he touched his son's tiny hand. "You are both so beautiful. Thank you, Florence. Thank you for this gift." The first months of Samuel's life were exhausting, but filled with wonder. Florence had never known she could feel such fierce, protective love, or that watching a baby learn to smile and coo could bring such disproportionate joy. Xander was a devoted father, taking turns walking the floor with Samuel when he fussed at night, making silly faces to elicit baby giggles, already planning for the day when he could teach his son to ride and work with the cattle. Life settled into a new rhythm, busier than before, but deeply satisfying. Florence felt that she had finally found her place in the world, that everything she had experienced, all the loss and grief and uncertainty, had been necessary to bring her to this moment, this life, this family. When Samuel was 6 months old, Florence began writing again, not letters this time, but a journal documenting their daily life, the small milestones and ordinary moments that made up their existence. She wrote about Samuel's first tooth, about the day Xander taught her to shoot a rifle for hunting, about the spectacular display of wildflowers that carpeted the meadows in July. She wrote because she had discovered that words were her way of making sense of the world, of capturing and preserving the fleeting beauty of each day. One evening, as she sat at the kitchen table, writing while Samuel slept, and Xander worked on mending a harness, he looked up and smiled at her. "What are you writing about?" he asked. "Everything," Florence said. "Today, mostly. How Samuel laughed when you were playing with him this morning. The way the light looked on the mountains this afternoon. How grateful I am for this life we have built together." Xander set aside the harness and came to stand behind her chair, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. "Do you remember when you told me about all those letters that came back unopened? How lost you felt, like your words had nowhere to go." "Of course I remember," Florence said, leaning back against him. "I am glad you found me," Xander said simply. "Glad you took the risk of writing to a stranger, of coming to this remote place, of trusting that there could be something good waiting for you here. I know your letters to Robert never reached him, but in a strange way I think maybe they reached exactly who they were meant to reach. Maybe the universe knew you needed someone who would read every single word and understand what you were really saying." Florence turned in her chair to look up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I used to think my life ended when Robert died," she said quietly. "But now I understand that it was just beginning. Everything I have now, everything I am, started the day I decided to write to you instead of continuing to write to a ghost. You saved me, Xander. You gave me back my life." "You saved yourself," Xander corrected gently. "You made the choice to keep living, to keep hoping. All I did was give you a reason to take that chance." They stood together in the kitchen, holding each other as Samuel slept peacefully in the next room, and the mountain wind whispered around the eaves of their home. Outside, the last light of day was fading from the peaks, painting the snow pink and gold. Inside, the lamp burned warm and steady, illuminating the life they had built together from courage and letters and love. 2 years later, Florence gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Clara as planned. She had Florence's dark hair but Xander's eyes, and from the beginning she was a force of nature, willful and fearless in a way that both delighted and terrified her parents. Samuel adored his little sister, following her around and trying to protect her from her own adventurous nature. The ranch prospered as Xander's reputation for honest dealing and quality livestock grew. They added more acreage, hired additional hands, and began raising horses as well as cattle and sheep. Florence transformed the large garden into something truly impressive, growing not just vegetables for their own use, but flowers that she dried and pressed, sending them to a botanist in Denver who paid her for specimens from the high country. It was not much money, but Florence enjoyed having her own income and the intellectual challenge of learning to identify and preserve the plants. Mrs. Chen became a permanent fixture in their household, less an employee than a beloved member of the family. She doted on the children and provided Florence with both practical help and deep friendship. Pedro married a woman from Silverton and brought her to live in the small house Xander built for them near the ranch boundaries. Jakob and William remained bachelors, content with the rhythm of ranch work and the simple pleasures of meals around the bunkhouse table. Animas Forks itself grew and changed over the years, new families arriving to work the mines or start businesses, though it remained a small and close-knit community. Florence became known for her generosity and her willingness to help anyone in need, whether that meant nursing the sick, teaching children to read, or simply offering a listening ear to those struggling with the harsh realities of mountain life. She never forgot what it felt like to be alone and uncertain, and she made sure that no one in Animas Forks felt that way if she could help it. The letters that had brought her and Xander together remained precious to both of them. Florence kept them in a wooden box in their bedroom, tied with the same string Xander had used when he brought them to her in Denver all those years ago. Occasionally, she would take them out and read through them, marveling at how much had happened since those early days of tentative correspondence, how much they had both grown and changed and yet remained fundamentally themselves. On their 5th anniversary, Xander gave her a gift that took her breath away. It was a leather-bound journal, beautifully made with her name embossed in gold on the cover. Inside the front cover, he had written an inscription. "For Florence, who taught me that words matter, that expressing what is in our hearts is not weakness but courage. May you always have something to write about, and may our life together give you stories worth preserving. All my love, Xander." Florence threw her arms around his neck and kissed him deeply, grateful beyond words for this man who understood her so completely, who saw her gifts and nurtured them rather than feeling threatened by them. "I love you," she said fiercely. "I love you so much it sometimes frightens me, because I cannot imagine life without you now." "You will never have to," Xander promised, holding her close. "We have built something strong here, Florence, something that will last long after we are gone." He was right, though neither of them could know then just how true his words would prove to be. The years rolled past, marked by the changing seasons and the growing of their children. Samuel grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books as much as horses, while Clara was a wild thing, happiest when she was exploring the mountains or helping with the ranch work. They were different as could be, but they loved each other fiercely and formed a united front against any outside threat. When Samuel was 10 and Clara 8, Florence gave birth to another son, Thomas, a surprise baby that arrived when they had thought their family was complete. Thomas was a happy, easy child, content to be passed around among his various caregivers and delighted by everything he saw. His arrival brought fresh joy to the household and reminded Florence and Xander of those early days with Samuel, though they approached parenthood with more confidence and less anxiety the third time around. The year Thomas turned 3, disaster struck Animas Forks. A late spring avalanche roared down from the peaks above town, destroying several buildings and killing 4 people. The Morrison Ranch was spared, being farther down the valley, but the devastation to the community was immense. Xander immediately organized rescue efforts, and Florence opened their home to those who had lost everything, feeding and housing displaced families until they could rebuild. In the aftermath of the tragedy, many people chose to leave Animas Forks, deciding that the risks of living in such harsh country outweighed the benefits. The population of the town, never large, dwindled to fewer than 50 permanent residents, but those who stayed including the Morrison family, developed an even stronger sense of community and mutual support. They knew they could depend on each other in times of crisis, and that knowledge created bonds that transcended ordinary friendship. Florence wrote extensively about the avalanche and its aftermath, trying to make sense of the senseless loss, to find meaning in the tragedy. Her journals from that period were darker than her earlier writings, but they were also powerful testimonies to human resilience and the capacity for communities to heal and rebuild. Years later, a historian would discover these journals and publish excerpts in a book about life in Colorado mining camps, bringing Florence a small measure of posthumous fame she never sought in life. But that was far in the future. In the present, Florence focused on the daily work of living, of raising her children and supporting her husband and maintaining the home that was the center of their lives. She took joy in small things, the first wildflowers of spring, the sound of her children's laughter, the feel of Xander's hand in hers as they sat on the porch in the evening, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Samuel, at 15, began talking about going to college, about studying literature, and maybe becoming a teacher. Xander, who had never had the opportunity for much formal education himself, was determined that his children would have every chance he had missed. He and Florence began setting aside money for Samuel's education, planning for the day when their son would leave the mountains for the wider world. Clara, at 13, announced that she had no intention of ever leaving the ranch, that she would stay and help her father run it, and eventually take it over herself. Florence worried about her daughter's wild independence, the way she chafed at any attempt to teach her the domestic skills that young women were expected to master. But Xander just laughed and said Clara was a born rancher, and there was no reason a woman could not run a ranch as well as any man if she had the skill and determination. Thomas, still young at 8, was content to follow his older siblings around and absorb their very different worldviews. He had something of both Samuel's thoughtfulness and Clara's adventurous spirit, and Florence suspected he would forge his own unique path when the time came. The years continued to pass, each one marked by its own challenges and triumphs. Samuel did go away to college, first to Denver, and then to a university back east, though he came home every summer and never lost his love for the mountains. Clara indeed took over more and more of the ranch work, proving herself as capable as any of the hired hands and earning her father's deep respect. Thomas discovered a gift for working with horses, gentling even the most fractious animals with patience and an almost uncanny ability to understand what they needed. Florence, approaching 40, found that her own role in the family and community continued to evolve. She became a midwife, drawing on her experiences with her own children and her natural compassion to help other women through the ordeal of childbirth. She also began teaching school part-time, when the regular teacher fell ill, discovering that she had a gift for inspiring children to love learning. Through it all, her relationship with Xander remained the bedrock of her life. They had been through so much together, weathered so many storms, both literal and metaphorical, that their love had deepened into something unshakable. They knew each other completely, all the flaws and strengths, all the dreams and fears, and they chose each other anew every day. On their 20th anniversary, Xander took Florence on a trip back to Denver, their first time away from the ranch together since the children were born. They stayed in a nice hotel, ate in fancy restaurants, attended a concert at the Opera House. It was wonderful to experience the city together, to have time alone without the constant demands of ranch and family. But Florence found that she was homesick for the mountains, eager to return to the life they had built in Animas Forks. "This is nice," she told Xander as they walked through the city streets one evening, "but it is not home. Home is with you and the children in those mountains, in that house where we have been so happy." "I feel the same," Xander agreed, squeezing her hand. "When I am away from the ranch, I feel like I am missing a part of myself. Everything that matters to me is there." They returned home to find that the children had organized a surprise party, inviting the entire community to celebrate their parents' anniversary. There was food and music and heartfelt speeches about what Xander and Florence meant to Animas Forks. As Florence looked around at the assembled faces, at the people who had become her friends and neighbors and extended family, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the life she had been given. 20 years ago, she had been lost and alone, writing letters to a dead man because she had no one else to write to. Now she was surrounded by love, rooted in a place and a community that gave her life meaning and purpose. And it had all started because one man, a stranger who owed her nothing, had taken the time to return her unopened letters and offer her his friendship. That night, lying in bed beside Xander, with his arm around her and the mountain wind singing its familiar song outside their window, Florence thought about all the paths her life might have taken, all the choices she had made that led her to this moment. She thought about Robert, and while the pain of his loss had long since faded, she felt a bittersweet gratitude for what he had taught her about love, even if their story had ended before it really began. But mostly she thought about Xander, about the extraordinary gift he had given her by seeing her pain and offering her hope, by reading every single word she wrote and responding with words of his own until they had woven a connection strong enough to build a life on. "What are you thinking about?" Xander murmured sleepily. "Just how lucky I am," Florence whispered back. "How grateful I am that you asked me to write to you all those years ago. I do not know where I would be now if you had not." "You would have found your way," Xander said with certainty. "You are too strong, too determined to have let grief defeat you. But I am glad I got to be a part of your journey, glad that we found each other when we did." "I love you," Florence said, the words as true and heartfelt as the first time she had spoken them. "I love you too," Xander replied, pulling her closer. "Always have, always will." The years continued their relentless march. Samuel finished his education and accepted a position teaching at a college in Denver, though he brought his new wife home to meet his family, and spoke often of maybe returning to Colorado permanently someday. Clara did indeed take over running the ranch, partnering with her father until his advancing age made the physical demands too difficult, and she became the primary decision-maker. She married one of the ranch hands, a good man named David, who respected her strength and worked alongside her as an equal partner. Thomas, to everyone's surprise, became a veterinarian, studying in Denver but returning to set up practice in Silverton, where he could serve the ranching communities of the San Juan Mountains. He married a woman named Anna who shared his love of animals, and they had 4 children who filled the Morrison house with noise and laughter whenever they visited. Florence and Xander aged gracefully together, their bodies slowing, but their minds remaining sharp and their love undiminished. They became grandparents and then great-grandparents, the center of an ever-expanding family that remained close despite the distances that sometimes separated them physically. Florence continued to write, filling journal after journal with the story of their lives, the history of Animas Forks and its people, observations about the natural world around them, and reflections on the human condition. Her writing evolved over the years, becoming more philosophical and contemplative, but it retained the honest emotional core that had characterized even her earliest letters. On their 50th anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a massive celebration. The house overflowed with people, with noise and laughter and love. Florence, now 73 years old, stood on the porch with Xander, now 76, and surveyed the scene with deep contentment. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked him. "All these people, all this life, springing from those letters we wrote to each other?" "I hoped for it," Xander said honestly. "But I never dared believe we would be this blessed. You gave me everything, Florence. A home, a family, a purpose beyond just surviving. You made my life worth living." "We gave each other those things," Florence corrected gently. "That is what love is, I think. Not one person saving the other, but both people choosing to build something together, something bigger and better than either could have created alone." They stood together watching their family, their legacy, and Florence thought about the long road that had brought them here. She thought about the girl she had been at 22, broken and lost and desperate for something to hold on to. She thought about the moment she had decided to write back to Xander, to take a chance on a stranger's kindness. That single decision had changed everything, had set in motion a chain of events that led to this moment, surrounded by love and life and family. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Florence leaned against Xander and felt his arm come around her, as solid and dependable as the mountains themselves. They had built a good life together, a life filled with purpose and meaning and deep, abiding love. The letters that had brought them together were still in their wooden box in the bedroom, preserved and cherished, a testament to the power of words and the courage it takes to open your heart to another person. "Thank you," Florence whispered, not sure if she was speaking to Xander or to the universe or to the God she sometimes prayed to in the quiet moments. "Thank you for all of this." Xander kissed the top of her head and held her close. "Thank you for writing to me," he said. "Thank you for every word, every letter, every day of the past 50 years. I would not trade a single moment of it." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky and their family's laughter drifted out from the house, Florence thought about how strange and wonderful it was that her life had turned out this way. All those unopened letters, all that grief and loneliness had been necessary to bring her to this place, this man, this life. She would not wish the pain on anyone, but she could not regret it either because it had made her who she was, had prepared her to recognize and appreciate the gift of Xander's love when it was offered. The evening grew late, and eventually their children and grandchildren began to drift off to their various sleeping arrangements, the house slowly quieting as exhaustion overtook excitement. Florence and Xander remained on the porch, reluctant to let go of the magic of the day, wanting to hold on to this perfect moment for just a little longer. "Do you think we have a few more years left?" Florence asked quietly, voicing the fear that had begun to haunt her as they both grew older and more fragile. "I hope so," Xander said honestly. "But even if we do not, even if tomorrow is all we get, we have had more happiness than most people experience in a lifetime. We have built something that will last long after we are gone. Our children and grandchildren will carry on, will remember us and the love we shared. That is as close to immortality as humans get." Florence nodded, knowing he was right, but still greedy for more time, more days and months and years together. She was not ready to let go, not ready to face a world without Xander in it, even though she knew that day would inevitably come for one of them. But tonight was not that night. Tonight they were together, surrounded by family, filled with good food and joy, and the satisfaction of a life well lived. Tonight was a gift, and Florence had learned long ago not to waste the gifts she was given. They stayed on the porch until the night grew cold enough that Florence shivered despite her shawl, and then Xander led her inside to their bedroom. They prepared for sleep with the comfortable efficiency of long practice, and when they finally lay down together in the bed they had shared for 50 years, Florence curled into Xander's embrace with a sigh of contentment. "Good night, my love," Xander murmured, his voice already drowsy. "Good night," Florence replied, pressing a kiss to his chest. "I love you more than words can say, though I will keep trying to find the words anyway." Xander chuckled softly. "That is my Florence, always writing, always searching for the perfect phrase." They drifted off to sleep together, and Florence's last conscious thought was a prayer of thanksgiving for the life they had shared, for the letters that had brought them together, for every single day they had been given. They did have more years together, as it turned out. 5 more good years, during which they watched Thomas's youngest daughter get married, celebrated Samuel's retirement and return to Colorado, saw Clara's ranch continue to thrive under her capable management. 5 years of sunrises over the mountains and evenings on the porch, of grandchildren's visits and quiet afternoons reading together, of the simple pleasure of holding hands and knowing that you were loved completely and without reservation. Xander died peacefully in his sleep one October night, just as the aspen leaves were turning gold and the first snow was dusting the high peaks. Florence woke to find him gone, his face peaceful as if he were simply dreaming. She held him for a long time, unwilling to let go, tears streaming down her face as she said goodbye to the man who had been her partner, her best friend, her great love for more than half a century. The grief was immense, a tidal wave that threatened to drown her. But Florence had survived grief before, and she knew that she would survive this too, though she would never be the same. Xander had left her with so much, 3 children who loved her, grandchildren and great-grandchildren who filled her life with joy, a community that valued her, and memories enough to last whatever time she had left. She returned to writing with a vengeance in the months after his death, filling page after page with memories of Xander, with stories of their life together, with reflections on love and loss and the courage it takes to keep living, even when the person you love most is gone. The writing helped, gave structure to her grief, and a way to process the overwhelming emotions that threatened to consume her. On what would have been their 56th anniversary, Florence took out the box of letters, the ones that had started everything. She read through them slowly, hearing Xander's voice in the words he had written decades earlier, remembering the excitement and hope and nervous anticipation that had characterized those early days of their relationship. She read her own words, too, seeing the pain and loneliness of that younger Florence, the woman who had thought her life was over before it had truly begun. And then, moved by an impulse she did not fully understand, Florence took out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write one more letter. "My dearest Xander," she wrote, "I know these words will never reach you, just as my letters to Robert never reached him. But I need to write them anyway, need to tell you one more time how grateful I am for the life you gave me, how much I love you and miss you and wish you were still here beside me. You told me once that you would read every single word I wrote, and you kept that promise for 55 years. I hope, wherever you are now, that you can somehow still read these words and know that my love for you has not diminished, even though you are gone. I hope you know that you made my life beautiful and meaningful, that every day with you was a gift I will treasure forever. I hope you are at peace, and I hope that when my time comes, I will find you waiting for me, ready to begin whatever adventure comes next. Until then, I will keep living, keep loving our family, keep writing the story of our life together so that our grandchildren and great-grandchildren will know what we had and maybe find the courage to build something equally beautiful in their own lives. All my love, always and forever, Florence." She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the box with all the others, a final addition to the collection that chronicled their love story. Then she closed the box and returned it to its place, feeling a sense of completion, as if by writing that last letter, she had brought their story full circle. Florence lived for another 3 years after Xander's death, staying active and engaged with her family and community until the very end. She died at the age of 81, peacefully in her sleep, like Xander before her, in the house they had built together all those years ago. Her children and grandchildren gathered to mourn her passing and celebrate her life, sharing stories and memories that painted a picture of a woman who had loved deeply, lived courageously, and left the world better than she found it. In her will, Florence left instructions that the box of letters be preserved and passed down through the family, along with her journals documenting their life in animus forks. She wanted future generations to know their story, to understand that love was worth fighting for, that taking risks could lead to extraordinary rewards, and that words mattered, that expressing what was in your heart could change your life and the lives of those around you. Clara took possession of the letters and journals, reading through them with tears streaming down her face as she discovered aspects of her parents' relationship she had never fully understood before. She saw the young Florence who had been so lost and found hope in the kindness of a stranger. She saw Xander's growing affection expressed in careful words, the evolution from polite correspondence to deep intimacy. She saw the building of the life she had grown up taking for granted, understanding for the first time the courage and determination it had required. Years later, when Clara's own children were grown and she was thinking about her legacy, she decided to donate the letters and journals to the Historical Society in Silverton. She wanted to share her parents' story more widely, wanted others to understand what life had been like in those early days in the San Juan Mountains, how communities were built and families were forged in that harsh and beautiful country. The letters became part of an exhibit on frontier women, and Florence's journals were transcribed and published in a small academic press. They became valuable historical documents, providing insight into daily life at high altitude in the late 19th century, the challenges faced by ranch families, the resilience of mountain communities. But more than that, they became a love story that resonated across time, touching the hearts of everyone who encountered them. People came from all over to read about Florence and Xander, to trace the evolution of their relationship through the words they had written to each other. Young couples starting out were inspired by their dedication and devotion. Older couples saw their own long marriages reflected in the steady accumulation of shared years and experiences. Single people found hope in the idea that, even after loss and grief, love could bloom again if you were brave enough to open your heart. The house in Animus Forks, though the town itself eventually became a ghost town as mining operations ceased and people moved away, remained in the Morrison family for generations. Clara's descendants maintained it as a summer home, a place to return to and remember their roots. The porch where Florence and Xander had spent so many evenings together remained sturdy, and if you sat there in the twilight, you could almost hear their voices carried on the mountain wind, still talking, still sharing, still loving each other across the boundary of death. And in museums and archives, in historical societies and university libraries, the letters remained, preserved under glass or carefully digitized for future generations. Physical evidence of a love that had begun with returned correspondence and grown into something that transcended time and death. proof that words mattered, that human connection was worth pursuing even when it seemed impossible, that courage and hope and the willingness to try again could transform a life. Florence had written those first letters to Robert out of habit and grief, unable to let go of the past. But when Xander had offered to read her words instead, when he had promised to value every single thing she had to say, he had given her more than just a sympathetic ear. He had given her a future, a reason to keep writing, keep hoping, keep living. And she had done the same for him, transforming his lonely existence in the mountains into a rich and meaningful life filled with love and family and purpose. Their story became a testament to the power of human connection, to the way simple acts of kindness could ripple out across time and space, touching lives in ways we might never fully understand. It reminded people that love could be found in unexpected places, that it was never too late to start over, that the words we wrote and spoke and shared with each other mattered more than we might ever know. And so, the story of Florence and Xander Morrison, of letters that came back unopened, and a cowboy who promised to read every single word, lived on long after both of them had passed from this world. It lived on in the memories of their descendants, in the preserved documents of their lives, in the hearts of everyone who encountered their story and was inspired to be braver, kinder, more willing to take chances on love. In the end, Florence had been right when she wrote in her journal that their love had created something bigger and better than either of them could have built alone. They had created not just a family or a successful ranch, but a legacy of hope and courage that would endure for generations, reminding people that even in the darkest moments, even when it seemed like everything was lost, there was always the possibility of finding love again if you were willing to reach out and take the risks. Their letters, once destined to remain unopened, had instead opened doors to a lifetime of love and partnership. And that, Florence would have said if she could, was the best ending anyone could hope for. Not just happily ever after, but happily earned, happily chosen, happily fought for, and built with patience and dedication and unwavering commitment. That was the real fairy tale, the one that lasted beyond the final page, echoing in the hearts of all who heard it and dared to hope for the same kind of love in their own lives.